Welcome to the ninth episode of Behind the Algorithm, where today we'll be delving into the exciting subject of space. And joining us on this journey is Craig Jones, who leads the Innovation and Collaboration Centre for Adelaide University, an incubator for, among other things, startups focused on space technologies.
Thanks, Greg. And Craig, great to see you again. Before we dive into the heart of the episode, I would like to take a moment to set the scene for our audience. People often view space programs and exploration with a sense of skepticism, but space holds a lot more value for us on Earth than might be instantly obvious. In 2023, the value of the space industry was approximately 630 billion USD. This is globally. By 2035, it is projected to be worth 1.8 trillion, growing at an annual rate of 9%, which is outstripping global GDP growth. And this is according to a McKinsey and World Economic Forum report. Now, to contextualize 1.8 trillion US dollars, to be honest, sometimes these numbers don't really have that much meaning. That is the projected GDP of Australia in 2026, which has a population of just under 28 million people and is the 15th largest economy in the world. So that kind of shapes that up. But looking beyond those numbers, and to bring this even closer to home, for those of us who have the good fortune to live in advanced economies, our everyday lives are already dependent upon the space industry and technology. From grocery deliveries to our king of the mountain cycling records, banking transactions, our commute to work, and even the clothes we choose in the morning, these are all shaped by the space industry and technology. And this is only just the beginning. Space holds the potential to radically transform humanity and human achievements, both positively and with the consequences depending upon the path we choose. So Craig, thank you for joining us today. You've spent time looking at how emerging technologies move from idea to real-world use. That gives you a useful lens for today's conversation. Before we start, how do you usually explain what you do to someone outside tech or the space world?
I guess I would explain it as helping. You've kind of talked a little bit about that already, taking early stage ideas and giving early stage entrepreneurs the foundational knowledge that they will need to try and turn that into a scalable business. Some of that is technical knowledge, but a lot of that ends up being networks and communities of people around them. People have been there and done that before. People have built businesses successfully. How can they learn from those people around them? And how can they build their networks so that they can go speak to as many people as possible about the idea that they've got and check that it's a problem that people want solving and that it has real world application and it's a problem that people will pay to be solved. So we're trying to give those early stage entrepreneurs as many skills and as many networks and connections as possible.
And how much, just of those entrepreneurs you deal with, what's the percentage which are space tech based? How many of those are you dealing with?
Yeah, so we run an industry agnostic program for any kind of generally disruptive technology.
Yeah.
And that's probably about 65% of our cohorts. And then the rest is space. In South Australia, we've been running a space-specific program for about 8 years with the support of state government, who wants to see the space industry grow here. So that's been anywhere between 5 and 10 companies per year from the space sector that we put through our program.
It was interesting. I was looking the other day at the space sector, and I think there's 76 space startups in Australia at the moment, and also in South Australia you've got the space agency based there as well. So it's quite handy to have them on your doorstep.
Yeah, we have a number. We have the space agency. We have a number of foundations. The Andy Thomas Space Foundation, which is the national organisation. There's some there's quite a lot of those startups that are based in South Australia that you mentioned, but also we've got established scaling space companies like Fleet Technology, Newman Space, these larger, well-established companies that are choosing to base themselves in South Australia because of the kind of community and ecosystem that there is for space.
Okay.
I've always been a bit skeptical of space. So up until the point that I was doing my research for this exact podcast. So I wonder, for anyone who you speak to, maybe within your social circles, maybe beyond that, who maybe asks you what you do for a living, and they kind of go, as I have said in the past, we've got enough problems on Earth. Why do we want to go to space? What's your general response to those kind of people?
So I think it's a reasonable question, and I think it's a reasonable skepticism to have. Space for most people feels pretty distant. abstract. And I think people understand inherently that it's quite expensive to do things in space. So when you're living in if there's a cost of living crisis and worse happening throughout the world, why are we spending money on those things? I think what I tend to talk to them about is what's their first impressions of space. So when we're talking about space, what's coming to mind straight away? And you'll often get some kind of variation on, well, it's billionaires firing rockets into space. It's all of these sort of vanity missions of we're doing it because we can and because it's cool. Those things exist, and I share a similar discomfort around some of those things that happen sometimes. But I think that isn't the entirety of what's happening in space. And I think what the real issue is for people is what's the perceived return on public money. So what public money is being spent on things, and is there a value back to real people on Earth around that? And that tends to be where then I try to get into the conversation about, well, helping people understand how there are things happening that are very invisible to most people in space that are affecting us in our daily lives, and affecting research and betterments that happen on Earth. There's awesome stuff happening in drug discovery in space. Microbiology experiments in space, I think, are a fascinating area of research because of the tremendous things that happen around how proteins grow in space. They grow with much higher precision. You can better understand sort of disease mechanisms by looking at what happens in space. That translates directly into better cancer research around diseases for degenerative neurodiseases. And so those things are more tangible for people to understand. Money being spent on firing something up into space because we're going to test biological experiments on a satellite.
Yeah.
The point of that is that we will get better outcomes for the people who live on Earth.
I was just going to pick up on a point you mentioned just there about the people not appreciating or realizing quite often how much of the economy and what they do is underpinned by it. There's a statistic I read, and this is only UK, but a fifth of the UK's economy is underpinned by space technology and what's happening over there. And I don't know the statistics for Australia, so apologies that I didn't do that research beforehand. But yeah, it's amazing how much of our economy is dependent upon that. And that translates into billions and billions of pounds of the economy and people's jobs. And I think I looked at the statistic, and it's something like 48,000 people in the UK are employed in the space industry. And I think in Australia, it's around about 10,000. And I think they were aiming for 30,000 by 2030, was one
Correct.
of the stats I learned the other day.
Yeah, I think the way you were talking about that then about like it underpinning a lot of like underpinning the economy, the way that I've started to think about space is perhaps more of it being like an infrastructure. It's an invisible infrastructure. So if I get people to think about it more like electricity or roads, this is an infrastructure that is critical to the way you conduct your daily life. So going to work today, I use my GPS in the car. I go to a coffee shop and I buy my coffee. I sit down at work and use the internet. All of that is being powered by satellite data and satellite technology. So at a fundamental level, I'm using that in a very obvious way. But then we've got things like disaster response is incredibly dependent on Earth observation, satellite data. So is banking and logistics. So is crop management and food security. All these things that are a bit more invisible to most people, but it's an infrastructure that is critical to the way that businesses, economies, communities operate.
And I mean, do you know how much that is in Australia? Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No, I'm not going to guess, but I would say it's significant. We're a large country with a huge agricultural community and an agricultural economy. And having done work with the ag tech community, there's a huge reliance on sort of crop management and water resilience, how to better use your fertilizers, which is on your farms, which people are powering with satellite data. And so that is a huge economy for Australia. And if we were to lose or not be investing in that technology and in those satellite data, we would be impacting those farmers.
Yeah. It does, I suppose, without realizing it, it does underpin so much of what we do on Earth. And It was interesting. I was having a conversation as part of the research for this podcast. I was having a conversation with someone in my office last few days, and they're a huge fitness fanatic. So they track all of their data. They have their personalized programs. Greg, you'll do, because I know you're into your fitness as well. And I said to them, you didn't, if you do, and I said, we're talking about space. And I said, look, if you didn't have space, you wouldn't have your personalized fitness program. You wouldn't know how far you've cycled, how far you've run, what your speeds have been, everything else like that. And that personal training program wouldn't exist. And without that, then there wouldn't be the companies, because I look at also some of the startups. And people don't realize that a lot of those startups are dependent upon, say, those fitness startups, which are doing AI personal training buddies, are dependent upon the data which you're pulling from space-based technology as completely underpinning those new wave of fitness apps and personal training apps. So I think it is amazing. And I think, there's what I love as well is there's one case, and I think it's actually from your incubator. Was it eSpy or SSpy?
eSpy.
Yes. And I love one of those behavioral ones, which was around shark behavior. And
Yeah.
you probably know more about this than I do.
Well, yeah, they've done a huge amount of work on sort of fishery operations to be able to help the fisheries industry, but understanding and tracking shark movements as well became an additional avenue for them by using satellite data to track that, which is much needed in Australia. We have a lot of beaches here. We want to be able to track movements of sharks, but it's also information that I think environmentalists are interested to understand. What are their movements like? Are their movements changing? And are there things that we need to know about those different fish species to understand what's happening in our environment? So East by Ocean is a really good example of a company that set out to do one thing, and then by using satellite data realized they were able to tap into other industries that wanted to understand what's happening in the oceans.
I mean, I love that example. It's one of my favorite examples of AI and space coming together. And the reason why I love that so much is sharks are endangered, and it's helping us work and live in the environment far better than without having that information, without that knowledge. And it means that we don't have to use some of those more draconian type sharp control methods. If we can actually see where they are, predict their behavior, then we can actually give people alerts and warnings and stuff like that. And I thought that was an amazing amalgamation of two of my favorite topics now, space and AI, coming together to actually influence human behavior and making sure that we're looking after the environment at the same time as well, which I thought was quite amazing. And people probably don't even think about that. It doesn't register.
No. And I think we'll start to see that more and more, because there's definitely an economy in what's being put up into space sites that go up so that we get the Earth observation data. But the bigger economy sits on the downstream applications. So who on Earth is using that data in order to solve problems here? And with the addition of AI, so there was a great startup that's come through our program last year. How do we use AI to put Earth observation data into a layperson's hands in order that they can interrogate it and assess it and use it for their benefit? So if you can create an AI agent that can understand Earth observation data, can you then allow a layperson at a council to say, tell me what's happening with the traffic management in my city using the Earth observation data? Tell me where my power lines are overgrown by trees so that I can send my maintenance crews directly to the place that needs attention now, rather than having to send maintenance missions on scouting operations to work out where the vegetation is overgrown. So that kind of AI stuff is really getting really interesting when you connect it with space data. And the bigger economy, I think, is in the on-Earth use of space data.
And just with that, are we getting to a stage now with, when I look at space data, I look at a grainy picture taken from a satellite of a ship traveling across the ocean, as recently sort of in the news. Are we getting down to that level of detail from space where you can actually see trees overgrowing power lines? Is the technology becoming that good we can do that?
I think we're not quite there. I think we're not far off. You've got the real advances in things like hyperspectral imaging, which are being used in satellite imagery more. And that is
just for me, can you just to jump in, what is hyperspectral imaging?
So as as a non-space person, I will give you a very basic understanding. There's a
Perfect.
number of, most of our photos are taken with a spectrum of a certain number of colors. Can't remember what that is. Maybe it's 16 or 32 or something like that. Actual imaging is in the range of hundreds. So it's just a much higher spec camera that you can have at a higher altitude that can then take images of Earth and of other things and create and provide you with information back that you wouldn't be able to get through a normal camera. So hyperspectral imaging might often be used at the moment within mining to be able to take pictures of mining sites to be able to understand what's under the earth in a really specific way so that they can look at how they conduct their mining operations more efficiently. But the advancements of various different imaging is going to be able to eventually create much higher resolution images back to Earth. So I don't think we're quite at the level of being able to see, a 2-meter piece of vegetation, but I would hazard a guess that we're not far away.
I mean, you mentioned just now about the mining side of things and being able to look down from space and see where the minerals and is it so we can look down and see where the minerals and resources are?
So again, we're probably getting a bit beyond my full scope of knowledge of this, but yes. So there are images that are used. Metaspectral was a company that was in our program a few years ago, and they were looking at how they were supporting mining companies to identify the best places to mine at sites. I believe that's what they were up to. So yes, I think it's about what are the minerals under the earth and how you can use hyperspectral imaging to more accurately identify where they are is one of those into mining.
So we are truly dependent on, it underpins so much of our everyday life as it is today on planet Earth, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it reaches into many things. I mentioned disaster response earlier. Like in Australia, that's pretty key with bushfires and floods. This is happening across the world, and it's not just about the initial thing of how you save infrastructure and lives, but also it helps those disaster manage more efficiently the resources that they have. So there's lots of knock-on effects of those things. It's tipping into all parts of our lives.
So, Craig, only a few entities that's, be it your SpaceX, be it the US government, who is incredibly reliant on SpaceX, or be it Blue Origin or the Chinese, can afford to put rockets and satellites into space. So as Nigel said, as we begin to depend more heavily on them, where does the power actually sit, and what does that power actually give them the ability to do?
Yeah, I think this is a real potentially thorny issue. I think there are a number of sort of agreements and treaties that happened in the world around space that were forged at a time when only governments were doing things in space. And now we've got commercial actors coming in. They've got different business drivers and different reasons to do the things that they're doing in space. So I think we're at a potential risk of those companies aiming to be the first to get somewhere so that they can make the rules as they go. I think there's a current push across some of the bigger nations to define the rules for how we operate in space. And there's a few core principles that are really nice, but they're quite wishy-washy. They're like, no one owns the moon, and anything that's done on the moon is for the betterment of humanity. That's nice when you say those things. I'm not sure we're living in a world where that sort of handshake agreement goes very far. I think we're currently living in a time when actual law doesn't mean that people will stop people from invading another country. So what happens with moon resources or lunar resources or asteroid resources then becomes quite complicated.
Do the Artemis Accords cover moon resources, space resources?
I don't think I know the Artemis Accords well enough. I think what I understand so for the moon, my understanding at the moment is that no one can own the moon. It can't be owned by any particular nation, although that's roughly just in a treaty. Kind of any international law, whether that would make a difference or not, we don't know. And then the resources on the moon, it's been said they can't be mined, I think, for the benefit of an individual. It has to be for the benefit of everyone. I think we're a long way from having the capability and the technology to mine those resources that exist. And so hopefully in that time we can come up with a better set of principles for how we govern those resources. But I think saying it will be for the betterment of everyone, it will be shared equally, is a very nice statement, but I don't know how watertight that is. And what
I
it
mean,
means, things to different people, right? If you have something that broad.
I mean, like you said at the start, they're nice in principle, altruistic in principle, but the geopolitical landscape at the moment is fairly rocky, and we've got China investing in their own space exploration. We've got Russia investing in their own space exploration. Whoever's going to get there first is no doubt going to be exploiting things like helium-3 from the moon, and then they will be licensing, I would imagine, licensing the rights to sell those, or they will be selling them at a markup back down to corporations and governments on Earth, no doubt. How much do you get involved with kind of those geopolitical conversations, given that you're investing in companies that are going into space?
Yeah, so we have been working with a company for the past couple of years who's looking at a lot of that space regulation. And whilst their startup is around how do they streamline space regulation, they've been heavily invested in understanding those treaties and those principles that exist. So a lot of the knowledge that I have comes through that founder. I think as an organization, what we tend to do is look at what that startup is doing, and we're looking for, is the problem that they're solving a real problem, and what's the impact they're intending to have? We're quite keen that we're working with organizations that are intending to have a good impact on the world. So, one of the companies that we're working with is Paladin Space, who will be eventually putting things into space. So they will be contributing to what goes into space, but their whole business is built around, well, there's lots of debris floating in space. How do we clean that off? How do we bring it back down to Earth? Or how can we repurpose it in space so that it becomes more self-sustaining in orbit? So I guess what we try to do is look at each of the startups on their merit and understand, yes, what are they doing in space, but what is the impact that they intend to have as well?
That space debris thing is also quite a fractious conversation as well. Very contentious. What was I watching the other day? The outer orbit is 192 times the size of Earth. So there's a lot that can be up there. There's a lot that can be hidden up there. So for businesses, private entities to be going and scouring that space for space debris means they might find something that other countries, maybe nefarious countries, may not want them to find. Or that space debris could be picked up, brought down to Earth. Whose responsibility is it? But also what exists within it? What new technologies are in it that other countries can learn from, or other companies can learn from? There is that both conflict and competition between the two entities, both governments and companies. It just interestingly, does that ever come up in conversation when you're speaking to the space debris?
It does come up in conversation, absolutely. And I think what we are finding is that there are companies like Paladin Space that are looking at how you might clear up small fragments space debris. So they're looking at the really small things that are shooting around space at a phenomenal speed that could knock into something and cause a rupture. This is a new area of work. Like we've not been putting this amount of stuff into space for a huge amount of time. We're coming across these conversations and these problems as we go. A couple of years ago, Paladin came into our program with that idea on a page of technology that could identify small fragment debris and a unit that could go and collect it. That then leads on, as they've gone through their process, into conversations that is, okay, but whose is it when I identify it? How do I know whose bit of debris that was? Can I go and pick it up? Can I go and collect it? Who's telling me it's okay to go and collect that piece of debris? Do I have to go and speak to different nation authorities to get permission to do this? How does the regulations work to be able to do that? And then, of course, if you continue that kind of conversation on, you get into potential conversations of, well, could someone have a similar unit that goes around collecting things nefariously because they want that satellite not to be in orbit anymore, or they want to see if there's a new piece of technology on somebody else's satellite. I think as on Earth, there are people with good intentions, and then there's nefarious ways that you can use the same technology. But I think the problem that we've got here is that it's all pretty new, last couple of decades, where we're kind of having to think about these problems, and we're sort of having to solve the problem on the fly.
Do you find that there's there's minimal guardrails? Do you find that an exciting space, literally an exciting space to work in? The fact that you're working out this stuff as you're going along.
I think there is a real excitement in that. I think there's real risks and dangers. Like, things are moving at a really fast pace within the space sector. And so if you can't get a handle on these things quick enough, there's the potential that you lose control. So that's, there's excitement, but there's also a worry about those things. I think the space sector is more than just what we do in space. And so I think where my excitement tends to be around space is how can we use space technology and space data to make things better for us here on Earth right now.
So I just wanted to add a couple of points to something you raised, Craig, and also Greg, you sort of alluded to. In the research I was doing, apparently that we are tracking over 44,000 pieces of space debris. And currently, at the moment, there is over 3,000 defunct satellites orbiting the Earth. So this gives you a magnitude of sort of what the scale of the problem is that organizations like Paladin are trying to solve for. And what I find fascinating is around the whole geopolitics of it. Because as you rightly point out, actually solving the problem of how do I collect that debris and what's my exit strategy for those? Do I throw it into the Earth's orbit so it sort of burns up, or do I push it further out into space? Those things are fairly easy to solve in terms of the actual technical part of it. It's actually the politics on planet Earth and the geopolitics, which actually probably makes it a little trickier, because people are going, oh, I don't want you to have my technology, or that's mine. What are you doing touching my piece of satellite or my piece of hardware? And what I found interesting as well is, and I know this is probably less relevant to, say, conversations in Australia, but as part of the NATO alliance in 2019, they actually upgraded and changed not upgraded, sorry, that's the wrong way to describe it. They adapted the wording around Article 5. Now, Article 5 of the NATO alliance is that you attack one of us, you attack us all kind of principle. And they've also included that now in space. So either in space, from space, to space, any attack on that sort of infrastructure, which we use on a day-to-day basis, is now actually included as part of Article 5. Obviously, it's not a instant, what's it called? What's the correct term? Instant invoking of Article 5, but it will be included and captured as part of Article 5. So I just thought I'd add those pieces in there, because I think that's the fascinating part, is that the whole complexity around the politics of it. And that's really, it's us humans again, which seem to be confusing and making the matter even tougher than the actual problem we're trying to solve around space, something like space debris.
We're really good at that as humans. We're exceptional creating additional problems.
We do.
There's a number of things tied up in that. So yes, there's lots of space debris flying around in space. The projections are that it will get significantly worse. You can imagine that part of the change of Article 5 is an attack on one is attack on all, is that we're so dependent on space satellites for communication on Earth, for all of our banking, for logistics, that if that starts to go down, then nations could have a significant problem in how their economies keep going. But equally, there's as you mentioned, there's all of these pieces of fragmented debris flying around in space. There's a principle called the Kessler effect, that if a piece of debris hits one space and creates 5 more pieces of debris, and that keeps hitting and hitting, and suddenly that takes out everything in a certain Earth orbit, then we've got the same problem. So you need people to be thinking about, how are we going to solve the space debris problem? One of those is collect debris and try and recycle it somehow. The other is bring it into Earth's orbit and burn it up. I was reading something only last week about it's kind of a question mark over what that might be doing to the upper environment in Earth if we continue to do that. Just to kind of we probably need to work out, if we're going to start deorbiting lots of stuff, is there any knock-on effect to our own atmosphere if we continue to use that as a solution? But we've got to have a solution for this. There's a lot of rules and regulations now built into people who are putting stuff into orbits, putting up new satellites, that they have to have a plan for what is going to happen at the end of its life, that they have to deorbit, they have to decommission it somehow. You can't now just say, well, I'm putting it up and that's that. You've got to have a plan for what you intend to do with it at the end of its life.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's sort of talking about the planning. So if we start to look sort of 5-10 years ahead, what are the risks we're effectively locking in now? And what are the key ones which you think we need to be thinking about, which we're not paying attention to, which are then going to affect us significantly down the line? I know it's a
I
biggie
think,
to ask because there's so many.
yeah. So I think like space debris and just what's happening in particularly low Earth orbit, the amount of things that's there is a problem. I think we understand that it's a problem within kind of the space community and the space nations. What we do about that isn't quite understood at the moment. So I think what's good about that situation is we really understand that it's a problem. And usually when you've got a well-defined problem, that means there's a good market in trying to solve it. So you'll have good people trying to come up with solutions. So I think that's really good.
And do you think that's sorry to interrupt, but I want to just pick up do you think that's a problem which governments need to be solving, or is it companies, or is it a combination of the two, or where does that lie?
I think I think it lies with both. I think we have economics that mean governments don't have the budgets, or budgets are getting withdrawn, reduced all around the world for space. And so it's relying on commercial operators to work in this space. And I think that's true of most things, right? That's why, in my opinion, that's why we end up with not-for-profits, because they're doing the work that government should be doing. So like, it's not uncommon that this is where you might find other actors doing work that you might feel that the government should be doing. And I think it'll be a combination of both.
It was interesting. I was watching a lecture by Tim Marshall, who recently wrote a book about the geopolitics of space, or when I say recently, the last couple of years. And one of the points which came through from that lecture was, and some of the other research I was doing, is in the 90s, in the 1960s and 70s, when we sort of had that initial space race, it was very much about ideology. So between, say, sort of Western ideology versus maybe a communist and socialist ideology, whereas now it's no longer about ideology. It's actually very much about commercial interests. And if we look at what's happening with SpaceX, Blue Origin, various other sort of space programs, this is very much about the commercial opportunity which is being presented. And I do wonder, as part of that, is as we look into the future, if we allow commercial organizations to take the lead on sort of the space frontier and the new technology, when an organization which is, and Greg and I have talked about this extensively in the past, when an organization is focused on profitability and generating profit, sometimes it's a certain behavior. And is that a risk which we're potentially baking in now by not having governments lead it, or maybe not having the right governance models and the right communication between the different global entities to actually help shape that and those sort of frameworks and those regulations?
Yeah, you're completely right. When there's commercial drivers, what you're going to have is people frantically trying to be the first to do something to get there, to do the stuff in space, to develop the technology by all means necessary. And then hopefully they think they'll be there, able to set the rules after the fact. And I think that's what we're at risk of at the moment, is that it's moving at such a pace. And we've got these, like we were talking about, these ideological sort of treaties that were done in the 60s, which just don't bear any resemblance to the actors that we have, the significant actors that we have in the commercial operations of space at the moment. And so they don't really bear good resemblance. I think we're probably running to catch up.
And do you think when you talk about, say, we're running to catch up, do you mean this about the sort of regulations and the governance of it? Or do you think in terms of the actual technology competition between different powers and different geographies?
I think it's the regulations and the governance. The 67 treaty, a lot of the regulations and the treaties that exist, as I've already mentioned, are quite flowery language, quite poetic, about doing things in the best interest of everyone. We will share because it's the right thing to do. No one will own the moon, and we will share all the resources fairly. Those kind of things don't give us much to stand by in terms of governance and regulation. And I think it was in maybe the late 80s, something that was a lot more specific about regulations was proposed. So I think the 67 treaty has something like 150 nations signed up to it. And I think maybe they got 20 signed up to the one in the 80s or 90s or whenever it was, because it was much stricter and it was asking people to be much more heavily regulated. And it didn't happen. People didn't sign up to that treaty in the same way that they did for the poetic language of the 1967 treaty. So I think that, that in itself doesn't fill me with a great sense of optimism. But then you've got the Antarctic agreements, and there are other models that exist where we have collaborated for good research in Antarctic for all nations. And we have good models that exist on the International Space Station, of nations working together, conducting research side by side to do good things in space together. I think there's good building blocks there, but we need stronger governance so that you don't have commercial operators just putting their foot to the floor in an effort to be the first to win the race.
Yeah, I think I must admit, I do like the 1967 optimism. It was hopeful, wasn't it? Even though we were in the sort of middle of the Cold War, it was optimistic and hopeful. And one of the interesting things that I've learnt about the whole space race was, and even during the Cold War, space was an opportunity for the USSR and America to come together and still keep a sense of, even if they were having a Cold War about ideology, there's still an element of collaboration and cooperation and communication. And it's interesting now when we talk about the ISSS, which you raised just a second ago, is it due to be decommissioned by 2030, I think?
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And the whole space station was about a collaborative effort. Now and there's always been this optimism around humanity coming together, regardless of ideology, regardless of background, and all working together. And it's interesting that at the moment there seems to be competing views. So some people are sort of very optimistic about space, saying, 80 countries are now got in the space industry. And obviously there's different tiers within those countries of how heavily they're involved and what their capabilities are, but 80 countries are operating in space now. Whereas others are saying we're even more fractured than we used to be, when it was just the two sort of great superpowers who were sort of dominating those efforts. I think it's interesting. I think from my perspective as well, what I'd love to see is those frameworks come through and us sort of provide that governance. Because one of the things which has come across as well is this whole idea about, you talked about the moon being for everyone's benefit. But as I look into the legal side of things, I'm seeing that now people are going, well, if we land a base station here and we put some nuclear reactors here, as part of my understanding is part of the Artemis Accords, says that you're not allowed, we will not interfere with those, whatever you have on the planet, on the moon. And that essentially, whilst was the regulations from the 60s say the moon doesn't belong to anyone, people are now potentially going to start staking claims on the moon by putting their infrastructure there and putting in extra resources and so forth.
Yeah. So I think those are perfectly valid concerns. I would share them. I think the thing that I would probably say is we're a long way off from that happening, regardless of what the likes of Elon Musk might tell us. We're pretty far away from being able to do that. And so I think we've got some time to work out exactly how we might be able to collaborate on these things. I think there's a lot of space between where we are now and those kind of problems coming to fruition. And so I think some of that runway is what helps collaboration happen, that you've got time to talk about those things. It's what, the Antarctic kind of agreements were based on. They had enough runway to be able to get the agreements in place before people were setting things up in Antarctica. And so I think we've got a bit of time before we get to that position. We should absolutely be saying that this is a potential problem so that we can build it into the frameworks that we might put together.
So you're a space optimist?
I am a space optimist. I think I see... So the space program that I run definitely has people doing things in space. But as I said, I think the bigger economy is about what people are doing with space data and space technology on Earth. And I think that's really exciting to me, of all of the innovations that we use in our daily life currently that make our lives better, that make our health better, that make our food better, that make economies better. And I think there will only be more of that as we strive for different space technologies.
Fascinating. You picked on. Is there anyone's, like, if you had to pick one or two, is there any ones which you're particularly excited about, which are going to impact us on planet Earth, where you go, that's brilliant, that's going to be a real game changer?
I think there's been a fantastic organisation that we've worked with for a couple of years, who are looking at the problem that they were solving was, if we are going to do any significant space travel, then there's certain compounds for people's health that you would need for long-term space travel. That's really difficult to transport between Earth and something that might be happening in space. So how do you create a bioreactor that might be able to create these compounds in space? In striving for that, what they've got to try and make that bioreactor. That bioreactor has additional uses within disaster recovery zones or remote regions. We have huge remote regions here in South Australia, in Australia, where getting medical support to those regions is really difficult. If we could have a bioreactor that is able to create insulin on site, that would be fantastic for health outcomes for regional, remote and indigenous populations. I think stuff like that is really fascinating. And in doing that work, they're also potentially now looking at, to do that work on the bioreactor, they were looking at folding of proteins, again, things I don't fully understand. But that in itself has applications within cancer therapies. So by thinking about how you might be able to stay in space for long enough to be able to build colonies on Mars, the actual real applications that we're going to see within the next 10 years are going to be about how we improve health for people within cancer therapies, and how we help remote and regional communities to get better access to health resources.
So I suppose that begs a question, just with your enthusiasm. It makes me wonder, if you had the opportunity to go into space, would you?
Would I go to space?
Yes. It's only because you were talking about just now, you seem so enthusiastic about what's the power of space on Earth. I was wondering, would you then go to space yourself?
I've never been that fascinated by going into space. I'm going to leave it to other people to do that. I think the Earth's pretty good.
Yeah.
I like it here, and I enjoy working out how we'll be able to use some of that information to make people's lives and my life better on Earth. But no, I don't think I've got a deep desire to go into space. Do you?
No. Having is a straight answer. I went to a fascinating conversation with there's a British astronaut called Tim Peake, and I went to a talk. I took my eldest son to a talk with him about 3 or 4 months ago. And when he was explaining basically when you're in a rocket and what the power of the rocket you're sitting on, and basically it's essentially a giant, combustible, could go. I just thought, you know what? I'm happy on planet Earth. I'm quite happy with the environment I live in and occupy. I don't need to whiz through space at thousands of miles an hour. However, I must admit, I would love to see planet Earth looking back from space. I think that would be quite a magical experience.
Yeah, I would agree. I imagine that would be quite fascinating to see. But in the meantime, I'll stay here and look at them.
Yes, exactly. I mean, going back to our topic and what we were talking about, if we look today, what do you think what do you think's driving the urgency around having that conversation and educating people around space? And what do you think we need to be leaving people with to help them understand why this is such an important topic?
Yeah, I think getting people to understand just how much space is sort of as I said before, the invisible infrastructure that underpins our life is really important. The more that we can get people to understand that, I think the easier governments will find it to be able to invest in things that are to do with space. I understand the skepticism and the criticism around spending money on doing things in space when we have problems on Earth. It's getting people to understand that we're really, really reliant on space. And so what we should be thinking of is, when we're asking the questions about why we're spending money on space, ask, what problem does this solve for us? on Earth and who is going to benefit from it? I think those are really good questions to ask. That's just slightly different from the why bother spending money on space.
To be honest, I think we've covered a huge amount of ground here. And I think, leaving people with that understanding about what it is today that you want people to take away from this conversation is important. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to add as a final closing word?
I guess what just popped into my head as you were saying that statement is that space is full of plenty of experts at the moment. And one of the things that we need is more people who are translators and advocates for space. And so that is why I'm really keen on people understanding how, the broader public understanding how space impinges on their life all of the time. That this isn't something that is happening away in the ether. This is stuff that we interact with all the time. And that the more kind of translators that we have of this wonderful space technology and space data that we have, the more that I think we'll have an enthusiasm for the space sector. It is a nascent space sector in Australia, and particularly in South Australia. And we need more companies that are looking to solve really complex problems that will create a better life for us on Earth.
That sounds brilliant. If there's a job opening and it says you can send me the JD for a translator and advocate for space, I'll put my hand up for that one.
Perfect. Done.
Thank you.